Jesus' precious name I pray. Amen. Prayer is the topic I was planning to start a small series before we embark on our next big series, as we just finished our Gospel of John. It's a marathon series that we went through. I wanted to switch gears a little bit, and even as we celebrated our 7th anniversary as a church, and we look very comfortable, and we have survived all the ups and downs of the pandemic, and it's a time where we can typically feel fatigued, and for several of us, one of the first areas that gets impacted is prayer. And I'm doing this more as a selfish series, as God has been impressing on my own heart for me to grow more in my prayer life. And I've been reading and studying and listening to a lot of different people. And I thought it would be good to share out of that with all of you so we can all have this experience. And I've titled this as Prayer from Duty to Delight. Because prayer, despite all the blessings that we know come through it, for most of us still seems like a chore, isn't it? We tend to approach prayer more dutifully than as something we think that it can delight us. I was recently going to the San Francisco airport. I went to drop SAT, and as I walked out, right inside the airport terminal, before you could get on to the elevators, there were a group of men, I'm guessing mostly from the Muslim faith, who actually were sitting down in the center of the walkway doing their prayers very dutifully. As I saw that, I was taken aback a little bit, thinking, wow, because as most of you know, Muslims are required to pray 5 times a day, and they do it so dutifully. And the Jews are required to pray 3 times a day. And if you look at Hinduism, they have various forms of prayer and meditation that they do dutifully too, and it has spread and grown from mindfulness techniques to yoga to transcendental meditation. And these things have gotten very popular of late. Along with some of our friends, I was, when I went on a mission trip to North India, I could go to the birthplace of Jainism. And there's this huge hill, and all these Jain monks would actually sit inside a shrine, hurting themselves, literally like pulling their hairs and being ascetic so they can pray and not do anything else. And if you look at any native groups of people anywhere in the world, there's always some form of prayer that forms a central part of their life, and they do it so dutifully. In fact, even non-religious people pray at times. In a study in 2004, it found that even 30% of atheists admitted they prayed sometimes. And another study found 17% of non-believers in God pray regularly. But there is one place where prayer is very hard. And that's, I have this quote from Paul Miller. He talks about that. It may come up on your screen. It says, American culture is probably the hardest place in the world to learn to pray. We are so busy that when we slow down to pray, we find it uncomfortable. We prize accomplishments, production. But prayer is nothing but talking to God. It feels useless, as if we are wasting time. Every bone in our bodies screams, get to work. When we aren't working, we are used to being entertained. Television, the internet, video games, and cell phones make free time as busy as work. When we slow down, we slip into a stupor. Exhausted by the pace of life, we vegetate out in front of a screen or with earplugs. If we try to be quiet, we are assaulted by what C.S. Lewis called the kingdom of noise. Everywhere we go, we hear background noise. If the noise isn't provided for us, we can bring our own via iPod or plethora of other devices. Even our church services can have the same restless energy. There is little space to be still before God. We want our money's worth, so something should always be happening. We are uncomfortable with silence. One of the subtlest hindrances to prayer is probably the most pervasive. In the broader culture and in our churches, we prize intellect, competency, and wealth. Because we can do life without God, prayer seems nice but unnecessary. Money can do what prayer does, and it is quicker and less time-consuming. Our trust in ourselves and in our talents make us structurally independent of God. As a result, exhortations to pray don't stick. Wow, he nails it on the head, isn't it? But on the other hand, when we do learn to pray, the promise is that prayer doesn't offer us a less busy life. It offers us a less busy heart. In a culture that's all about hurry, prayer centers us and brings the rest and the peace we all need. As we read all the different books about prayer, there seems to be two distinct emphases on prayer, on two views of prayer. There are some who emphasize prayer as a means to experience God's love and to know oneness with Him. And when you read them, they talk about the promise of a life of peace and rest in God. On the other side, there are resources on prayer that see that the essence of prayer is not as inward resting, but as a calling on God to bring His kingdom. But we have the book of Psalms where we can turn to, which is filled with prayers. And you see both these kinds of prayers within the book of Psalms. There are psalms such as Psalm 27, 63, 84, and 131 that depict the adoring communion with God, how prayer brings us into a close communion with Him. For example, in Psalm 27, verse 4, David says that there is one primary thing he asks of the Lord in prayer: to gaze on the beauty of the Lord. While David did in fact pray for other things, he means at the very least that nothing is better than to know the presence of God. There's no other agenda. Therefore he says, "O God, my soul thirsts for you. I have seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and your glory, because your love is better than life. And I will praise you," in Psalm 63, 1-3. When he adores God in His presence, he says his soul is satisfied as with the richest of foods in the same psalm, 5th verse. That indeed shows us how prayer can bring us into that communion with God. The union with Christ that we spoke about in the Gospel of John for several weeks. The place where the union of Christ becomes real to you and me is in prayer and through prayer. You can read volumes of theologies on what union with Christ means, but you can never experience it unless we are on our knees in seeking that with God. But there are, however, even more psalms which look like a complaint or cries for help or calls for God to exercise power in the world. They are stark expressions of the experience of God's absence. And you see there, prayer is a struggle. Psalm 10, for example, begins asking why God stands so far off and hides himself in times of trouble. And you and I have experienced that, isn't it? When we are hit by some intense pain or suffering or tragedy, we feel like God's presence is not there. And in that psalm, the author suddenly cries, "Arise, Lord, lift up your hand, O God, do not forget the helpless." Yet then, he seems to speak almost to himself as well as to the Lord. "But you, O God, do see trouble and grief. You consider it to take it to hand. You are the helper of the fatherless." And this prayer, as he prays, he goes through a heart change, with the psalmist bowing to God's timing and wisdom in all matters, yet still fiercely calling for justice on earth. This is the wrestling kind of prayer, seeking God to intervene, to do something in this world. So you see, when you read the Psalms, you get both these two kinds of prayers. There are these prayers that draw us straight into the presence of God to experience His union, and there are these prayers that are seeking God to intervene, to do something in our life or in this world so His presence can be felt. And both are beautiful and powerful blessings of prayer, and we have them captured in all the pages of Scripture. But beyond looking at just the actual prayers in the Bible, if we try to look at the theology of prayer that the Bible talks about, the reasons to pray that are found in God and in our created nature as to why we are able to pray, first and foremost stands the astounding truth that we are told that Jesus Christ stands as our mediator. Sin has created a vertical distance between us and God, and it has also created a horizontal distance between us and Him, so we cannot go into His presence. And Jesus Christ, as our mediator, bridges that gap, and it is through Him, as our high priest, you and I, as priests, can enter right into God's Shekinah glory to experience His communion and to cry out for our needs and have our needs met. And that's what Hebrews talks about, chapter 4 and chapter 7. In addition, we are also told that God Himself dwells within us, Christ in us through His Spirit, and helps us to pray, so that even now by faith we may gaze and contemplate the glory of Christ. And you see, throughout the Bible, you see theological support for both these kinds of prayers, and it's important for us to first understand this, to ask ourselves, what kind of prayers am I praying? Are my prayers always only about seeking God to intervene when I'm going through a crisis, or it's a need-based relationship? Or do I also pray to experience this communion with God just for the sake of being in His presence? The Westminster Shorter Catechism tells us that our purpose is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. You see this blend of both. There is a kingdom prayer and there is a communion prayer. The two things, glorifying God as His kingdom comes on earth and enjoying Him, are two things it says is our purpose. So we may pray for the coming of God's kingdom, but if we don't enjoy God supremely with all our being, we are not truly cherishing the blessings of prayer. And so it's my desire as we go through this series that we can move from experiencing prayer as a duty to making it a delightful thing in our daily lives. It's not going to happen in one sermon. It's not going to happen in one day. It's not even going to happen if we do 21 days of prayer or 50 days of fasting. We can do, those are all wonderful tools to use. But it's going to take a little more than that. And it's my prayer as we go through this series that I would change and we would all be able to embrace these two dimensions of prayer in our daily lives. And so today I wanted to just, as a sample, share briefly from one of the prayers of David found in Psalm 39. And I'm not going to do a verse-by-verse exegesis of this as we do usually, but kind of give us a big picture of what's going on here and get inside the heart and mind of David as he prays this prayer. And then at the end, we are going to take a few minutes to use this template to actually pray. You know, the easiest thing to do about prayer is to preach on prayer, but Martin Lloyd-Jones said very beautifully, the most difficult thing is to actually pray. So it will be a travesty if we hear a great sermon on prayer and end up not praying and going. So though we don't do this usually in our worship services, I want to try this today and hope you guys are okay with it, even if it's a little bit uncomfortable to you. Psalm 39. You know, it says it's written by King David, one of the greatest kings of Israel, in whose line comes Jesus. He writes this psalm to a person named Jeduthun, whose name actually signifies praising or celebrating. And he was one of those who was ordained by the king in 1 Chronicles chapter 15, verse 6, for song in the house of the Lord with cymbals and psalteries and harps. And his children after him continued the tradition. So he is one person. David writes this psalm and specifically the prayer and wants him to sing it out. And what is so beautiful about this is there is a pattern that we can even find in our own lives. You know, God always allows some life circumstance that disturbs the status quo of our life as long as we keep going on an auto cruise mode to move us to pray towards Him. Otherwise, we just keep doing our thing day in and day out, you know, whether it's running the rat race or, you know, just being busy with stuff. But it's only when He creates this discomfort or a crisis or a tragedy or a pain, we tend to move towards Him. And I can attest to that, as most of us could. The times I have prayed the most fervently in my own life are some of the toughest times. You know, the two times that stand out to me are when, 20 years ago I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's, and along with 3 or 4 of our friends, we spent 5 days in fervent prayer. I've never had such intense experience after that. And the biggest miracle that happened in those 5 days was God changing my heart and making me ready to die when I started praying for a miracle. And though He delivered me afterwards. And recently was when I was watching my wife stand beside her dad on his deathbed, and we knew it was his last few days. I just prayed that God would give her at least one day to be with her dad, to say goodbye. And I've never prayed so intensely in my life. And I was asking myself, why do we have to wait for these real painful times to experience God through prayer? You know, the pandemic had many people think about life and prayer. But now even that turned into fatigue, isn't it? So here we see in the first few verses that there is some kind of tragedy that happens. There's some disturbing thing that happens in David's life. His life, though he was a king, we all know, was filled with challenges. All kinds of challenges. Some caused by his own self and his own fallenness. Some caused by those who were very dear and near to him, like his own son. And some by his enemies. And these were the ones that led David to go to God and pray. We don't exactly know from this psalm what was that crisis that went in his life, but you can see how he was responding to it. In the first 3 verses, he says, I said, I will guard my ways that I may not sin with my tongue. He didn't want to lash out and vent out his anger in saying things that he was probably going to regret later. He said, I will guard my mouth with a muzzle so long as the wicked are in my presence. There are bad people surrounding him. They are trying to hurt him. And he's trying to hold himself together. He says, I was mute and silent, and I held my peace to no avail, and my distress grew worse. As long as he's trying to fight this, and that's our default response, isn't it? When we experience a challenge, whether it is a small or a big one, our default response is to try and fight it by our own strength. But it then leads quickly to sadness and depression. He says, my distress grew worse. My heart became hot within me. As I mused, the fire burned, then I spoke with my tongue. He loses it. And thankfully, that's when he turns to God in prayer. And there are 2 things, 2 very simple things, that his prayer distills out for us. The first thing is when we turn to God in prayer, prayer helps us gain true perspective and purpose about life. Prayer helps us gain true perspective and purpose about life. Read these next 3 verses, verses 4 to 6. He says, O Lord, make me know my end, and what is the measure of my days. Let me know how fleeting I am. Behold, you have made my days a few handbreadths, and my lifetime is as nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath. And then he just pauses because it hits him hard. Surely a man goes about as a shadow. Surely for nothing they are in turmoil. Man heaps up wealth and does not know who will gather. The first thing that happens when we begin to pray or enter into God's presence is it makes us recognize our insignificance. Our problem with all of us is we usually have a very high view of ourselves. That is the source of all our problems, isn't it? That is the source of the origin of the fall or the first sin in itself. I remember when I was in Freiburg, during my grad school, my professor took me around to give a tour of the city. And every German city has this big church in the center of the city. And Freiburg had what is called as the Münster. They built it over 250 years across 3 generations. Just huge, it's humongous. And my professor, his name is Professor Jürgen Ruhe, as we walked in, he himself is actually an atheist and agnostic. He just told me, do you know why this church is so huge? Why people spent 3 generations building it so it's so tall and big? He said they did this so that when people enter the church, they can instantly recognize how small they are and how big God is. It wanted them to have that aura about God. Today we have all these modern church structures, and probably that's exactly not the feeling you get. In fact, we try to make it more cozy by giving you all these cushioned seats, and we have to caffeine you up so you'll stay awake during the sermon. But that's not how it was. One of the biggest threat to prayer, one of the reasons why we don't go to God is because of the sense of self-sufficiency. And this faith in our self-ability to take care of things. That is the biggest threat to prayer. And let's begin by analyzing ourselves. And ask yourself this question. How much am I a self-reliant person? And how is that working out for you? In life, in relationships, does it actually help us experience joy and peace? And if not, that should drive us to pray as it did for David. Because instantly David, once he gets a sense of perspective about life. Wow. He says, make me know my end, God. It looks like I'm trying to build the greatest kingdom on planet Earth. And I'm the smartest guy, I'm the best musician, and so gifted and so talented, and I'm just riding the wave, but what is it for? Let me know the measure of my days, and let me know how fleeting I am. It says, my days are like hand breadths, and my lifetime is nothing in the light of eternity. And then he zooms out and talks about all our lives. He says, all mankind is a mere breath. Man goes about as a shadow. He says, you're just a shadow. And yet we think that's the real deal. And spend all our time and energy and efforts into it. And lose the real perspective. And what is the purpose? Work consumes so much of our time, isn't it? The pandemic and the work from home and the hybrid work structures have ended up making people work more than they have been before. He says, surely for nothing they are in turmoil. Man heaps up wealth and does not know who will gather. If we think money is going to solve our problems, and we end up pursuing that at the cost of spending time with God or our friends or our family, he says, it's going to be futile. If you die tonight, you have no control who's going to use up all the wealth. And that perspective comes when we spend time in prayer. And we need to be reminded of our life's purpose and have this perspective that this is just a short time and we are created for eternity. And God is working in you and me to prepare us for eternity, to be in His presence, to be like Him and to reflect Him. And prayer is one thing that reminds us, so you stop praying, we are going to keep going in this trajectory of self-sufficiency and self-reliance and being autonomous until we crash or something comes in our way. The second thing prayer does, it helps us see our true needs. And the psalmist talks about 3 simple needs in this passage. Verse 7, it says, and now, O Lord, for what do I wait? My hope is in you. The first need you and I need is hope. Because, you see, we need to hope in God and not ourselves. And it is because we hope in ourselves, we end up working more and earning more and buying more. Because there is no hope in that. But once we turn our hope to God, is when we can experience more of Him. And that's our first need. We all need hope. Because despite all the money you can accumulate, when we leave this world, or if our loved one leaves the world, It's not what they leave behind for us that's what we look for or what we lose. The one thing that someone who has lost a loved one wants is to be able to see them again, to hear them again, and to talk to them again. They'll pay anything to do that, isn't it? And the one place you can have that is only if you have that hope in Christ. And if you have not spent your life centering your life around enhancing that hope by growing in your faith in Christ and the gospel, hope will suddenly not come one day for you. And that is where prayer is a discipline that God gives us to practice experiencing hope on a daily basis. We need it every day. The second need, he points out in verse 8, says, "Deliver me from all my transgressions. Do not make me the scorn of the fool." Again, David realizes, I need hope, but I am so messed up. Our problems are not outside of us, our problems are within us. And so he wants forgiveness. He knows he has messed up big time in life in several ways. And if you are going to be in God's presence, and there are these unresolved things in our lives, we're not going to be able to experience and enjoy his presence. And so he says, I need forgiveness, Lord. And third, in verses 9 to 11 and the rest, what he prays for is peace with God. You know, when we try to live lives contrary to God's desire and plan, we're not going to have peace with God. You know, unless our life reflects God's holiness, we cannot have a peaceful relationship with Him. And so David longs for that. In verse 9, he says, I am mute, I do not open my mouth, for it is you who have done it. When we do those things, God creates things in our life. You know, C.S. Lewis says, pain is God's megaphone to draw our attention towards Him. And so David is experiencing, he's interpreting these events happening around him as people coming after him, as God trying to get his attention, and realizes that he's not at peace with God. And so he prays, God, remove your stroke from me. I'm spent by the hostility of your hand. When you discipline a man with rebukes for sin, you consume like a moth what is dear to him. And he closes again, surely all mankind is a mere breath, and pauses again. So in this prayer, David began in a very difficult place, and through prayer was able to experience hope, forgiveness, and peace. Isn't that awesome, my dear friends? And I want to stop here, and we can go on and more in depth, but I want us to take 6 minutes to use this psalm as a template to just pray. Pray right now. You could perhaps find someone right next to you or behind you, or if you're not comfortable, you can do it by yourself. And just pray for these 3 things. You know, you could share perhaps what is the personal challenge you are dealing with right now. And to know what that is, I'm sure we all have something. What is the thing that you think about that keeps you awake at night? And if you're comfortable, share it with the other person and ask for prayer and pray for them. You can just spend 2 minutes to do that, just a minute each. And secondly, you can pray for getting perspective in life, like David did. You can use those same verses and ask yourselves, put yourselves in his shoes and pray those words, and use your own words and ask God to show you. If you're at loss, what's happening in my life? Where am I? What's going to happen in the future? And then spend the last 2 minutes praying for experiencing hope in whatever situation you are, forgiveness if there are things in your life that you want to be freed from, and peace. Shall we do that? I know it's a little bit out of the box. We don't do it every time. We'll have a timer going for 6 minutes, and you can watch that. And at the end of 6 minutes, we'll have Brandon come and play a song for us, and then we will get back. And I'll come back and close us in prayer for communion.